Hello and welcome to the PLURI course on EU policy and multilingual education. This course forms part of the PLURI project, which is co-funded by the European Union. It is intended for teachers, educators, and practitioners of all kinds who want to learn more about managing linguistic diversity, but who are new to the topic. We have prepared a set of videos for you covering different theoretical and practical aspects related to multilingualism. Please subscribe to our channel and feel free to contact us with any questions you may have. A quick disclaimer, any opinions presented in these videos are our own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the European Union or the European Education and Culture Executive Agency. My name is Olesya Chayka and I work with a migrant-led NGO called Koopkultur in Berlin, which supports multilingual learning in schools and communities by drawing on research, practice, and lived experience. As a multilingual person and a parent, I bring professional and personal perspectives to questions of language, identity, and inclusion. And in this part of the course, I invite you to explore these issues from both theoretical and practical points of view. In other videos, my colleagues cover EU policy topics, translanguaging, and combining language learning with sustainability by using garden and natural materials as learning resources. In this session, I'm going to introduce biographical sensitization as a foundation for multilingual learning. Before students can engage with language at school with confidence, for example, by speaking up, experimenting with words, or using more than one language without fear of correction, they need time and support to reflect on their own experiences, their family practices, and their everyday use of languages, such as who they speak which language with, how languages are used at home, or which routines involve language. Biographical sensitization helps students understand where language comes from and why they matter in real life. For example, where language enters the family history, when it is used, and what role it plays in daily communication. This is especially important in migration context, where languages and traditions are often not openly discussed or passed on unevenly. Through simple low-threshold activities, teachers can connect learning to students' lived realities without requiring personal disclosures, and this approach fosters awareness and confidence. It also creates a sense of safety, which is essential for meaningful and inclusive multilingual learning. This means students feel safer participating, asking questions, and use languaging without worrying about being judged. Let's start. You can ask, why do family practices and biographies matter for learning at all? Children do not start school as blank slates. Their life stories include migration, language shifts, caregiving roles, and adaptive skills. When these experiences are ignored, lessons may feel unrelated to students' everyday realities, languages, or responsibilities outside school. When this experience is acknowledged, students begin to see themselves in the learning content and understand why it matters to them personally. However, students often struggle to see why their family language belongs in school and why it should be talked about at all. This is not surprising. Many children, particularly those in migrant communities, are not explicitly taught the importance of family languages and traditions. Parents may prioritize rapid integration, while schools may avoid the topic altogether. As a result, some children become indifferent to these languages and traditions. Others may even resist them. Understanding children's background allows educators to introduce this topic step by step through everyday examples rather than direct instruction, assuming prior knowledge. Without this biographical layer, multilingual and cultural activities can seem abstract or irrelevant. In this part of the course, we will focus on how children's biographies and family practices can support learning in everyday school settings. You will explore why these experiences matter for learning. You will also learn how they can be used as starting point for discussion, reflection, or language-related tasks in the classroom without asking children to share private or sensitive stories. We will consider biographies in relation to how students engage with language, culture, and school. For example, how they participate in lessons, relate to school norms, and position their languages in school context. We will also address intergenerational dynamics after migration. Parents, grandparents, and children often have very different views on what should be passed on, such as which language to use, which traditions to maintain, and which experiences to talk about. Understanding this helps teachers to avoid making assumptions and to provide better support for students' attitudes towards language and identity. For example, when students express pride, ambivalence, or resistance towards certain languages. You will learn how to design simple, low-threshold biographical activities that are safe, voluntary, and flexible, using everyday practices rather than fixed cultural labels. Finally, we will demonstrate how biographical sensitization can be connected to multilingual and inclusive practice, showing how this groundwork can make later language-focused activities more meaningful and effective in the classroom. We start with culturally responsive family engagement because it changes the way schools engage with families. Rather than seeing families primarily as supporters of school activities, this approach recognizes that families possess knowledge, practices, and experiences that shape children's learning. This is important because many children experience a disconnect between home and school. The knowledge that family pass on to their children through languages, routines, values, and ways of caring is often invisible in school, since these forms of knowledge rarely appear in textbooks, classroom tasks, or assessment criteria. When schools focus only on events or celebrations, these everyday realities are missed. Culturally responsive engagement is about building trust, and trust develops when families feel their experiences are acknowledged rather than judged or evaluated. It recognizes that children's learning is deeply connected to what happens in their families, and this remains true even when families are busy, under pressure, or navigating migration. The concept of funds of knowledge helps us to understand why children may appear to be disconnected from the languages and traditions of their families. The term means that families possess a wealth of knowledge in the form of skills, routines, histories, and values from their everyday lives, not from school. It means that students are not empty or lacking, but come to school with valuable experiences, and schools often fail to recognize their relevance to learning and build on it. This is even more complex issue in migration context. Families may lay down these resources in order to help their children integrate, avoid discrimination, or succeed academically. Consequently, children may grow up using family knowledge without acknowledging, appreciating, or reflecting on it. This is one reason why students may struggle to recognize the value of family languages or traditions late in their life. They were never acknowledged as knowledge in the first place. In order to understand children's attitudes towards language and tradition, it is also necessary to consider intergenerational dynamics. Following migration, the needs of different generations can vary significantly. For example, grandparents may focus on preserving memories and continuity. Parents, meanwhile, often strike a balance between heritage and integration, sometimes protecting their children by abandoning certain practices. Meanwhile, children are focused on belonging, their peers, and their future in the new context. These differences can result in silence, gaps, or even resistance surrounding family traditions and languages. For example, certain languages are not spoken, stories are avoided, or students reject family practices altogether. Schools cannot and should not resolve these tensions. However, they can provide a space where students are not required to explain themselves or defend their experiences. In such spaces, children are encouraged to explore these issues without fear of judgment or blame. Using children's biographies when teaching helps to connect new learnings to what students already know from their own lives. When lessons build on personal experience, learning becomes easier to understand, remember, and apply, because new content is connected to situations students already know from their own lives. Biographical work also encourages reflection. By reflecting on their experiences over time, students can recognize patterns and understand how past situations influence their present and future choices, such as noticing how earlier experience with language shape how they speak, learn, and make decisions today. Working with stories can strengthen language skills in a meaningful way. Students practice sequencing using time makers, evaluating events, and considering different perspectives in real-life communication. In multilingual and migration context, biographical approaches can support students to make sense of who they are, where they come from, and how different parts of their lives fit together. At the same time, structured sharing of experiences promotes empathy and intercultural understanding within the classroom, where students learn to listen to other experiences and recognize similarities and differences without judgment. Why it is important to integrate biological practices into the school routines? Biographical learning increases children's engagement because it clearly connects school content to their own lives. It also empowers students and they recognize the skills and strategies they already use to overcome challenges, such as adapting, mediating, translating, or taking responsibility. Biographical work also offers teachers valuable insights into their students' backgrounds, interests, and resources. This insight enables more responsive teaching by adapting tasks, examples, and topics more closely to students' interests and realities. It also creates opportunities for cross-cultural projects, for example, in languages, social studies, history, and ethics. For families, these approaches demonstrate that home languages, traditions, and migration experience are recognized as valuable learning resources. When stories are invited rather than evaluated, trust and collaboration flourish. Biographical work in education can be powerful, but only when carried out under clear conditions. First, participation must always be voluntary and clearly defined. Students need to know that they are in control. They can choose what to disclose, what to fictionalize, and what to keep private. This protects students from pressure and prevents students from being pressured to revisit painful experiences of disclosure more than they wish. Secondly, reflection must be structured and guided. Carefully designed prompts, shared group norms, and follow-up discussions help transform experience into learning opportunities. Without this structure, biographical work can simply be an exercise in exposure rather than a meaningful educational process when students may end up sharing personal stories without understanding why they're doing so or what they're learning from it. Finally, it is essential to offer multiple ways of participation. When students can work orally, in writing, visually, or digitally, we increase engagement and participation. Biographical activities become accessible to learners of different ages, language levels, and abilities. And these conditions help to ensure that biographical learning is inclusive, safe, and effective for everyone. In this section, I'm going to shift our focus from theory to practice, examining how biographical and family-based approaches can be integrated into school settings. Before any biographical information is shared, it is essential to establish group norms that everyone agrees to. These norms clarify expectations and foster a sense of safety. Students need to know that they are in control of what they share, that active listening is valued as much as speaking, and that nobody is required to justify their experiences. Having explicit norms in place reduces pressure and helps students understand that the activity is about learning, not performance. Structured reflection begins with carefully selected prompts. Rather than asking students to talk about their family in general, the focus is narrowed down to one small everyday practice. This could be a routine, a habit, or an activity that people in the family regularly engage in. These prompts encourage students to reflect rather than reveal personal information. They encourage learners to describe, observe changes, and establish connections without becoming overwhelmed by emotion. The aim is clarity of thinking, not depth of disclosure. Once students have worked individually or in small groups, the focus of reflection should shift from personal stories to collective observations. By focusing on patterns rather than individuals, teachers reduce exposure. At the same time, they encourage analytical thinking. Students learn to compare experiences, recognize similarities and differences, and reflect together without singling anyone out. This step transforms sharing into shared learning. Reflection becomes learning when experiences are connected to broader questions. Guided follow-up discussions help students to move beyond mere description. Teachers can link biographies inside to learning objectives such as language awareness, social change, or sense of belonging. This ensures that biographical work is clearly connected to curriculum aim and educational outcomes, rather than being isolated. Not all students reflect best by speaking. Providing multiple formats such as writing, drawing, symbols, or short exit notes makes reflection more inclusive. These options reduce language barriers, support different abilities, and enable private processing. When reflection is multimodal, more students can participate meaningfully and safely. Practices listed here are examples of straightforward ways to work with children's biographies. This includes simple activities such as mapping everyday family practices, working with objects or artifacts, creating timelines, conducting short real or imagined interviews, and developing collective stories or scenes. These practices do not require students to share personal sensitive information. They are flexible and age appropriate and can be adapted to suit different subject, language level, and time frames. The focus is on everyday experience rather than fixed cultural identities. When used in this way, biographical practices help students to make connection between learning and lived experience. They also prepare the ground for multilingual, intercultural, and inclusive work later on. As we come to the end of this section of the course, I would like to invite you to pause and reflect on the following 3 questions. First, consider your own setting. What family practices are present or discussed in your classroom or learning space but remain invisible? This could include languages, routines between students, ways of showing care, or small traditions. Secondly, consider one small biographical activity that one could safely introduce. This doesn't need to be a large project. It could be a short written reflection, an object-based task, or simply mapping everyday practices. Finally, reflect on how this biological sensitization might support multilingual awareness later on. When students begin to understand their own experiences and family practices as meaningful, languages also gain value and context. These questions are not meant to be answered all at once. They are starting points for gradual change. Over time, they help biographical sensitization become part of everyday practice. And as a result, students become more open to working with languages later because those languages already have meaning and context. Before we close, here is a quick note on references. You'll find a selection of key texts and resources in the video description. If you are interested in exploring the topic in more depth, you will also find a link to the full reference list here. Thank you for watching and for taking time to engage with this session. Before moving on, please pause and reflect on how these ideas connect to your own context and practice. And if you feel comfortable, please share your reflections or questions in the comments. Your contributions will help us to create a shared learning space. As this session formed part of a wider course, I encourage you to watch the other videos to gain a deeper understanding of these perspectives. You can find more information and resources on our website, and if you'd like to stay connected, please subscribe and follow our work.